And welcome once again to another of the monthly Schaefer Study Center public lectures. Tonight's topic is Margaret Thatcher. I've got some pictures up her there, and we'll talk a lot more about her. And I have some books over here, which are guaranteed to be thorough and exhausting in every sense of that word. Because those 5 books that are lined up on the back row there are actually only 2 biographies of her. The 2 on the left are a 2-volume biography, and the 3 on the right are her authorized biography in 3 volumes. And it took the author 22 years to complete. He was commissioned in 1997, and I think he got the last one published in 2019. So it's very recent, and it is definitive, and it is exhausting in every sense of that word. And I went through it. I actually got all the way through. So I have far more stuff in my head than what I can talk about in 1 hour, but I'm going to try and summarize things and hit the high spot. So welcome once again. This is the Francis Schaefer Study Center public lecture, and sponsored by the Study Center. We were founded in 2004. Our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. And it is named for the influential theologian and apologist, Francis Schaefer. And at some point, I think I probably ought to do a lecture on him. So there's some pictures of our students. In addition to sponsoring this lecture series, the Francis Schaefer Study Center offers a high school program which is built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization. We begin with the ancient world in 9th grade and finish with the 20th century in the 12th grade. Actually, we get a little bit into the 21st century now. But my students actually learn about Pope John Paul and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, which I think is somewhat exceptional these days because I'm not sure they're covered in public school. I'm not sure public schools do much history anymore. They do social studies. And I wouldn't necessarily trust their bias on those 3 individuals because they are still controversial, as I will discuss in the lecture tonight. So a little bit about me. Married for 48 years. Actually, that's going to change. In 2 weeks, we come up on 7 times 7. So we'll do our 2 weeks from Thursday. We'll be 49 years. We have 12 children, 3 sons and 9 daughters, and so far, 22 grandchildren, 9 boys and 13 girls. I got my undergraduate degree from Davidson College in North Carolina with a major in history and German. I did a master's at Stanford University in history and humanities, and my area of specialty is the Renaissance and the Reformation, actually. The Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Reformation. I have been a historian, a teacher, and an author for 30 plus years now. I was for a while a college professor, and God delivered me because I don't know that I would have survived the last 20 years in academia. I was briefly city manager here. I am still the publisher of Greenleaf Press, and together with my wife, we are the co-directors of the Francis Schaefer Study Center. So, without further ado, what's something you already know about Margaret Thatcher? First female prime minister. Yeah, they've since had one more, but she was the first female prime minister of the UK. Theresa May. Briefly was prime minister. Yeah, anything else?
Socialism is great until you run out of other people's money.
Yes. That is a quote from her that I dearly love. Socialism is great, but sooner or later you run out of other people's money. Yeah. So she was a huge proponent of free markets and competition and an advocate of getting government out of economic competition with private businesses. And we'll talk some about that. She transformed the United Kingdom after it looked as though it were going to be socialist forever. With the way things had gone in the 50s and 60s. And then along came Margaret Thatcher and said, no, we're going to unwind. Maybe not all of that, but a lot of that. Anything else?
Leftists finally got a woman in power. They hated her.
Right, yeah.
There's a movement over there right now that's similar, but I don't know if it's strong enough to actually catch.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a political shakeup possible right now. There's a Labor government again, and they're the Liberal Party of the two. There's the Labor Party and the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party is also known as the Tories. And the Labor Party won a surprise election. Keir Starmer was prime minister. He was then forced out, and I've forgotten the current guy. But when a parliamentary election is held in the UK, it is a mandate for 5 years. And so an election has to be called at the end of 5 years, no matter what. At any time within the 5 years, if the government loses a vote of no confidence in the parliament, then they'll have an immediate election. But that will only happen if there are people who are defecting from the party that holds the majority. Or the prime minister, the head of the party that's in power, can call a snap election anytime within the 5 years they want and win 5 years from that point on. So they typically look for a point where they think their popularity is very good, very high, maybe 2 or 3 years into their 5-year term. They'll call another election if the polls look good so that they can get 5 years while they're popular. Margaret Thatcher is the only prime minister in the modern universal suffrage era to have ever won 3 consecutive elections. Which meant she led her party to 3 elections where her party won a majority. Nobody else has ever done that. So and that's since the great reform bills of the 1830s. So we're coming up on 200 years. In 200 years, she's the only one who ever did it. And at the end of the biography there that I prefer, I'll talk about those in a minute, he kind of wryly observes that as it turned out, the Labor Party spent 10 years unsuccessfully trying to defeat her and never succeeded. She eventually was forced to resign, not by losing an election to the opposing party, but by betrayal from within her own party that forced her out. We'll talk about the reasons for that. They're a little bit complicated, but worth talking about. All right, so she is like John Paul and Ronald Reagan, of the generation at the very beginning of the century. Pope John Paul was born in 1920. She was born in 1925. Ronald Reagan was the oldest of the 3. He was born in 1911. And since her retirement in 1990 and her death in 2013, and because she lived in and was prime minister through the 1980s up until 1990, we have just an incredible wealth of primary sources about her. She wrote 2 books on her own life and a book on international affairs after she retired. There's a comprehensive database of 8,000 speeches, interviews, press conferences, and statements that's maintained by her website, margaretthatcher.org. And her private papers are at Cambridge. There's a story behind that, by the way. They're not at Oxford, they're at Cambridge. Over 1 million documents covering her childhood to the end of her life, personal correspondence, her appointment diaries, speech drafts, political files, all kinds of things. And then the official government papers from her over 10 years as prime minister in the National Archives. There used to be a 30-year closure period that actually would have ended in 2020. So everything is now publicly accessible. Her cabinet papers, her correspondence with ministers, with foreign leaders, policy documents, all of that is at the National Archives. And then there are a number of other sources that the author of the authorized biography got access to. Found letters that she had written over the years to her older sister that nobody knew about. In fact, her older sister dug them out of different shoeboxes and things in the attic that were letters that she had sent home. She didn't write very often to her sister, but often enough. Secondary sources. Well, there's this short little biography here, which is the one I started. It is described in its puff marketing piece as a concise, elegant, single-volume overview by a leading historian. He actually wrote her biography for the Oxford Dictionary of English political figures. However, I don't like it very much. He dismisses and minimizes her accomplishments. And like the rest of the Oxford crowd, even though she has a degree from Oxford, she studied at Oxford, he kind of dismisses her as not very bright and really just the beneficiary of good luck and circumstances and without any real consistent philosophy of her own. And she just kind of stumbled through winning 3 elections. It's kind of like, really? Okay. So I don't recommend that one. It's short, but I don't think it will help you in understanding her very much. The first major biography came out was John Campbell in 2 volumes, The Grocer's Daughter and The Iron Lady. We'll talk about those nicknames. 2000, 2003, he did not have access to her official papers or her private papers. And so there's some speculation in there that I think goes seriously off the tracks. And so the actual one that I think is the best is the Charles Moore biography in 3 volumes, which he started publishing in 2013 and finished in 2019, although he actually started drafting in 1997. He was her choice for an official biography, but they had a very interesting agreement. He had been the editor of the Daily Telegraph and had been a reporter in the 80s and had covered her. Then he went on to be the editor of The Spectator. Their agreement was that she would cooperate, make all of her private papers accessible, and recommend to all of her former associates and people she worked with in government to cooperate and give him interviews. And so he got sort of unprecedented access. And in fact, she persuaded the National Archives to grant him early access to all of her official papers. He did 600 interviews to write all of that. But the agreement that they had was she would not read the manuscript, that he would have complete editorial control, and he would not even submit it to her, and that it would not be published until after her death. So that's why the first volume comes out in 2013. He had actually finished the first volume and most of the second at the time she died in 2013. The other thing is, she didn't pay a penny to him or offer him any. The book was published by Penguin, and of course he is compensated as an author for Penguin Publishing, but he got no financial benefit from her or her estate. So he is remarkably detailed and does not cover up or lapse into hagiography. He's clearly conservative and clearly has a lot of admiration for her, but he's very quick to point out places where he thought she made mistakes or did things that were wrong, or where she misunderstood things, because he had so many incredible sources to draw upon in all of that. So if you've got the time and you get interested in her, those 3 volumes would be the ones I recommend. They are about 750 pages each. So they're not light reading, but they're very, very detailed. If you want to know the detailed story of any particular incident, it's like the encyclopedia of Margaret Thatcher. You can find it in the chapter, find it in the index, look it up, and at the point where she is being challenged for the leadership of the Conservative Party in 1990, he breaks the chapter down day by day, almost hour by hour, over the course of about 10 days from when the challenge started to when she finally decided that she would resign. So it's a very interesting background. And as I say, it's enough material for me to give a whole semester's worth of lectures on her life, which I will not do. I promise I will get you out of here in an hour. So yeah, that's the one. From Grantham to the Falklands, so it gets her through her first term. At her zenith in London, Washington, and Moscow, and she became really an international player. And she was the senior political leader among all the Western countries. Her tenure predates Reagan and predated the leadership in Germany and in France and in Italy. She was the senior political leader of the European countries at that point. And then finally, Herself Alone, which covers the events after her third term began in 87, up to her resignation in 1990, and then a very brief treatment of what she did for the next 23 years, because she retired in 1990 and did not, she passed away in 2013. All right, so let's talk about, the life of Margaret Thatcher in 5 acts. Early life and education. I continue to invoke Wordsworth because I think he's right. If you want to understand a historical figure, you need to understand what their childhood and family and education was like. It is the key to who they are. Wordsworth's aphorism was, the child is father to the man, or in this case, the woman. But I think it's very, very clear that her character and her interests and a lot of her personality were profoundly shaped by her family life, her early life, and her education. So we'll talk about that first. Then we'll talk about her early political career. Actually, she began in politics in 1951. She was only 26 years old when she ran for Parliament the first time. Now, she didn't win. She was known. I'll talk about how she came to be interested and how the Conservative Party actually came to recognize that she was an up-and-coming star. But when they first put her up for a candidate, they picked districts where they had never won, where she was very unlikely to win. But the way she performed was very impressive. So her rise to prominence, which began really in the 70s. From 1970 to 1980, we'll talk about, there was a conservative prime minister at the beginning of that decade and a Labor prime minister for the latter half of that decade. And then at the end of the decade, she led the Conservative Party to victory in an election, became the first female prime minister in the history of the United Kingdom. So she has 3 terms, 1979 to 1983. Could have held out to 84, but there were reasons why she wanted to call an election in 83. 83 to 87, again, she could have run that term to 88, but she called an election in 87 and won, and then served from 1987 to 1990. So we'll talk about those 3 terms, and an incredible decade in terms of both domestic events in England and international events in Europe and around the world. And then betrayal and retirement. She was not done in by the opposition. She was betrayed by her own party. So they never beat her in an election. All right. Born in October of 1925, Margaret Hilda Roberts in Grantham, Lincolnshire. And if you know anything about your English geography, that's sort of the Midlands. That's south of Northumberland and Yorkshire and north of London. It's roughly parallel to the great industrial cities of Manchester, but it's in a more rural part of the country, more toward the North Atlantic, the North Sea coast. Small town, maybe 20,000 people. And her father operated a grocery store. And she and her family lived above the store. And it was a very modest house in the 1920s. You can imagine, you remember, if you know, sort of what life in the United States was like in the 1920s. She was from a modest family. Her father did have his own business, but they were not wealthy. They owned the building, but the grocery store was in the first floor, and they lived on the second floor. They didn't have indoor plumbing for the first 15 years of her life. They had to go out in the garden, out back. She grew up above the family shop, and she grew up from the time she was 10 or 11 years old. She was helping in the grocery store. She ran the counter. She and her sister helped their parents. In the 1930s, early 1940s, she was educated at local schools, local private schools, because her father had enough disposable income to pay the tuition. So Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School, both girls' schools, she became head girl, which is a position of some honor and achievement. It meant not that she was so much popular with the other students, although that certainly helped, she was, but also that she showed enough academic promise that the faculty wanted to give her a position of responsibility. From there, 1943, she won a place, very competitive admissions process to Oxford University. She won a place at Somerville College. Her tutor was Professor Dorothy Hodgkin, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and she studied chemistry. And she's remembered as being quite a competent student, both theoretical and laboratory work. And her first job out of Oxford was as an industrial chemist. So she's a math science nerd. And her tutor, her professor there, Professor Hodgkin, remembered her as, and was not a fan of her politically, but remembered her as being a good student. During her tenure at Oxford, two things sort of tipped what her future interests were going to be. One was she joined the Oxford University Conservative Association, which was a little bit unusual in the 1940s. Between 1943 and 1948, there were not that many conservatives at Oxford. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were probably two of the only ones who could be counted in that corner. And she became president in her second or third year, I think, and got interested in the Conservative Party and began giving little talks and doing some campaigning for conservative candidates in the area around Oxford, and came to the attention as someone who was articulate and could hold her own even when she was being heckled. And so she thought about changing her major. 2-3 years into her course of study, she thought about switching to either economics or law. In fact, she went back to visit her father. Her father had since become involved in local politics in Grantham. Her father became a city council member and eventually mayor. And as mayor, he presided over the quarterly court sessions of the municipal court. She went back to sort of sit in at one of those quarterly sessions and met the solicitor, the attorney, who was assisting in all of that, and asked him, how do I get your job? How do I become a solicitor? And he said, well, I actually majored in physics as an undergraduate at Oxford, but then I got interested in the law, so I stuck around for an extra 2 years and got a law degree. And she said, I don't think the family can afford that extra 2 years of tuition. And he said, well, the other way to do it is take a job somewhere near London and come study at the Inns of Court. You can apprentice to a barrister who's already been admitted to the bar. They will teach you the law. You can study in the evenings and on your own, and eventually apply to take the bar exam and be admitted. That used to be possible in the United States as well. There are a number of attorneys who got their knowledge of the law by apprenticing to an existing lawyer and then sitting for the bar exam. It's very, very rare these days, although I think maybe it might in some states still be possible. So that's what she did. She took a job as an industrial chemist. She got a job. She turned down several higher-paying jobs that would have been 3 or 4 hours outside of London. She picked a job where she would be close enough, and she joined the Inns of Court. And the solicitor that she had the conversation with, she approached and asked if he would be her sponsor, and he agreed. She's one of the few women who was pursuing that, and found several of the junior barristers who refused to have anything to do with her. One of them refused to share an office with her. So she faced this again in 1948, 1949, 1950. This would have been an era when it was unusual for women to pursue professional training or degrees. Didn't deter her. Yeah, the Oxford University Conservative Association, one of the first women to hold that post. Went too far. She graduated with a chemistry degree and began work as a research chemist, British Xylenite in Essex and later at J. Lyons. There's a picture of her. She's on the left in 1945 when she's still an Oxford student, and her father and her mother and her older sister on the right there. So in January of 1949, someone who had heard her speaking as the president of the conservative students at Oxford said, you should consider standing for a seat in Parliament and apply to the Conservative Party, and they will find you a constituency. In England, unlike in the US, you don't have to be a resident of the constituency that you campaign for. You can live anywhere and the parties select the candidates for each constituency. So the safe constituencies they reserve for their senior party members. The ones where they've never won, they've never beat the Labor candidate, they let other people try out just kind of for fun. But you go around, you campaign, you give speeches, and you see how you're done. So she was selected as a Conservative parliamentary candidate for the parliamentary seat of Dartford, which is a suburb of London. And it had always been won by Labor. And she lost. She actually ran twice, 50 and 51. She contested Dartford in the general election. She was defeated both times, but she gained national attention because in 1950, she was 25 years old. She was the youngest female candidate for a seat in Parliament ever. Nobody at 25 had ever, it'd be like someone in the U.S. running for U.S. Congress at 25. It's very unusual. And she held her own in campaigning. She did debates in the district and stood down the hecklers and got the best of the Labor Party candidate on more than one occasion. So she's already starting to be noticed, even in her 20s. 1951, she married Dennis Thatcher. And the book goes into excruciating detail about the various people that she dated, 3 or 4 people she had dated before she met him and he proposed. He was old school conservative Tory. His family owned an oil company in the UK. He was the managing director, so he was very comfortably well off. And he was, she was 26 and he was 36 when they got married. So 10-year age difference. There's really nothing scandalous for that. The one little bit of scandal, which meant that they had a very small private wedding, was that he had served in the British Army in World War II and had gotten married in 1939, I believe. And within a month or two after getting married and being detailed with the Army overseas, his wife left him. The classic Dear John letter, I found somebody else. So when he came back from the war, they got a divorce. So in 1951, if you were divorced, it was a bit of a scandal. It was a bit of a black mark. It was a little bit embarrassing. And so they had a very quiet wedding with not a lot of hoopla or to-do. There was a small announcement in the papers, but yeah. So they got married, and she took herself out of conservative politics because she knew they wanted to start a family. 2 years later, they had twins, Mark and Carol. And she spent the next 4 or 5 years doing really 2 things: finishing up her law degree and getting admitted to the bar at the Inns of Court, and raising her small children. They had enough money, she was able to hire a housekeeper and a nanny, but she was very proud of the fact that she never hired a cook. She cooked breakfast and dinner every day. But they had a housekeeper and a nanny, so they were comfortably established. Qualified as a barrister specializing in tax law and began practicing 1953. She's 28 years old, married, got 2 small children, but she doesn't have to work. And so she pretty quickly gives up her job as an industrial chemist, switches to the law, and she's a partner with the man who had become her sponsor. And he sort of gives his blessing. If you want to get involved in politics, I don't mind. It won't hurt his practice any. So she put her name out to run again, and this is actually her at her first attempts in Dartford, where she didn't win. That's her at 25, the youngest candidate for Parliament in England. There's their wedding picture. He's 36, she's 26. And they apparently were quite happily married, and stayed married. He became the first husband when she became prime minister. They moved into number 10 Downing Street with her. He had his own company and had his own business, and he made trips every year overseas. They had large commercial clients in Europe, in South America, and in Africa. So he was typically gone for a month or 2 every year, traveling to promote and negotiate deals for his company. So she comes back into politics in 1958. She says, okay, I'm ready. The domestic situation is settled. I've got my professional degree sorted out, and I could devote myself to politics full time. And she asked to be put on the list. She actually is selected as the conservative candidate for Finchley, which was a winnable North London seat. There had actually been a conservative member of parliament from that district who had gotten old and was retiring, and they needed a replacement. So she's 33 years old, and wins the election. She stays as the member of parliament for Finchley until 1990. So 8th of October 1959, she's elected member of parliament for Finchley and supports the conservative government under Harold Macmillan, 1959. So her political career is launched. 1961, after spending 2 years as a backbencher where you make next to nothing and you have no responsibilities, except, meeting for general sessions and committees, she got an appointment to a position in the government. And she was given what was typically viewed as a woman's position in parliamentary government. She was Undersecretary of State at the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance, which meant she was in charge of the policy of dealing with supporting and making provision for the widows from World War II, and also people who were building up retirement and were old enough to retire and qualify, which were overwhelmingly women, because women have longer lifespans than men. So it's still true even in the U.S. The Social Security recipients, even in this country, skew female because women live longer than men. In 1964, Harold Macmillan lost an election, and so she goes into the opposition, which means the opposition always appoints a shadow cabinet and shadow secretaries. It would be as if the Democrats in this country told you who they would appoint to the various positions for Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Justice Department. They wouldn't wait till after the election. So in the British system, they tell you who are going to be appointed to those positions. And at the weekly parliamentary sessions where each of these ministers, because they're all members of parliament, stand up, they have question time. So the minister of the ruling party will stand up at the dispatch box and answer a question from the opposition, and it's the shadow from the opposition party who will stand up and challenge them on details in their department. By the way, they started televising those only in 1989. I had not realized that. I thought we'd had access to them forever. But yeah, the first live television broadcasts of parliamentary question times were in 1989. So she is now in the shadow government. They hold on to her. She did a very competent job. She was one of these people who understood spreadsheets before there were spreadsheets. She understood the numbers. She understood the budgets. And she could go over budget proposals, and she did very carefully. She had a blue fountain pen. There are literally millions of pages of government documents that have her blue fountain pen notes on them, beginning with these positions. So she was started out as the Undersecretary of State for Pensions, and then for Housing and Land, and then for Treasury, and then for Fuel and Power and Transport, and then finally Education. Now, education was kind of a, that was the women's job. They always had to have a woman in the cabinet, so it's, we'll find a woman to do the education department. And she was in the shadow cabinet from 1967 on. In 1970, the Conservatives won. And so under Edward Heath, she was appointed Secretary of State for Education and Science. So now she's still a member of Parliament. She still, every time there's an election, she runs from Finchley as the candidate for her party. But now she has got a position in the government, and it's a cabinet position. She is 45? Yeah, she's 45 years old. And Secretary of State for Education and Science. Yeah, here's the timeline here. So when she started at Oxford, Churchill was still the prime minister. And she met Churchill at least once. Churchill was thrown out at the end of the war. Shocking, surprising. Labor Party won the vote in 1945. Churchill was forced to move out of number 10. He came back in 1950 and was prime minister then, and then he retired in 1955 and passed the job. His chosen successor was Anthony Eden, who had been his Secretary of Foreign Affairs, succeeded by Harold Macmillan, and then finally Alec Douglas Home. And then Labor won in 1965 under Harold Wilson. Conservative came back under Edward Heath in 1970. That's when she got to be Secretary of Education. Heath's government fell apart. He did not win a second election. She had to go into the opposition again. We'll talk a bit about that and what that did for her career. There are her 3 elections down at the bottom of the list there, and then she's succeeded not by the opposing political party, she's succeeded by a member of her own party. So there she is in 1961 as Undersecretary of Pensions, and in 1970 as the Secretary of Education. Now, she got some bad press in her 1970 position because Heath's government was trying to deal with inflation and the pressures of international borrowing. They were looking for ways to reduce spending where they could, and so they asked all the departments to come up with a 5% cut. One of the things that she was asked to cut, it was not her idea. There had been a program in British public schools that elementary school students ages 7 to 11 were all given a small free pint bottle of milk every morning, most of which was not drunk, but they were available. And so there was a great deal of waste, and there was some controversy, and a lot of the students said, by the time it gets to us, it's warm, and who wants that? Anyway, so she went along with the proposal of the government to save money that they would cut the distribution of a free pint of milk to all the 7 to 11-year-olds, and the press dubbed her Margaret Thatcher, the milk snatcher. And there was it was one of those slow news weeks when there was nothing else going on, so they tried to make a big controversy over it, and she says, most of the kids don't want the milk anyway, it's being wasted, so, and the kerfuffle kind of disappeared in a week. But the nickname hung around for a while, and forever after, there would sometimes be hecklers who would bring it back up. Yeah. Full term of the Heath government, rising inflation, industrial unrest, there were minor strikes. Britain entered into the European Economic Community, not the European Common Market, but that was coming. She supported it. It was Heath's project, but Heath did not reverse any of what the Labor Party had done in the previous administrations in the 50s and 60s. He did not try and back away from any of the socialized industries that the government had taken over. Heath was trying to keep everything running, and to deal with unemployment, they were actually continuing deficit spending, which eventually caused a financial catastrophe for the British government. And in 1974, they lost the general election. There was a hung parliament because there was a third party. He did resign as prime minister. Labor formed a minority government, and she joined the shadow cabinet, initially shadowing the environment portfolio, which is something of a little more significance than education. There was a second election that year because neither party had won a majority, so they called another election. The Conservatives lost again. Heath's position as party leader came under intense pressure. He was refusing to resign. The Conservative Party had actually never created any set of rules or procedures for how you remove a party leader when he doesn't want to resign. They had to create the rules for that. It had been just sort of the proverbial smoke-filled rooms that used to happen in U.S. politics. The bigwigs, the guys would get together and say, well, who do we want? He was finally persuaded, and she put herself forward for party leadership. She defeated Heath on the first ballot, 130 votes to 119, at which point he resigned from his leadership position. He was already no longer the prime minister. It wasn't quite enough of a margin to give her a final victory under the newly adopted rules. So they had to have a second ballot. There was another opponent. It was sort of like, oh gosh, please, not the woman. We can't have the woman as the head of the party. So they recruited Willie Whitelaw, and he was kind of half-hearted about it. And she won the second ballot and became the leader of the Conservative Party, leader of the opposition, first woman to lead a major British political party ever. So here she is in 1975, leading the opposition against the Labour government. So that puts us right there against Harold Wilson, and then he resigned for health reasons and was replaced by James Callaghan, and she kept standing up at the parliamentary question time and just roasting him because she knew all the details. She would study intensely before the weekly session all of the policies, all of the budget details, and would just roast. He'd have to turn and call on other ministers and say, can somebody answer her question? It's not my department. Anyway, even though these were not yet being televised, she increasingly got a reputation as a fierce, debating opponent, unflappable, extremely knowledgeable, always extremely well prepared, and did not suffer fools, not just didn't suffer them gladly, didn't suffer them at all. So for the last 4 years of the 70s, she's the leader of the party. She rebuilt it around free market ideas, trade union reform, and a tougher stance on defense against the Soviet Union. And in 1976, she delivered a very strong anti-communist speech. She denounced the Soviet Union, you'll love this quote, as an evil empire. A number of years before Ronald Reagan used the same phrase. And the Soviet press reported on her speech and dubbed her the Iron Lady, which she loved. She called herself the Iron Lady after that. 1978-79, the winter of discontent is the way it's dubbed in English political history. There were strikes. The biggest thing were there were coal mine strikes, and England at that point generated all of their electricity using coal-fired plants. So it meant there were industry closures. Industries went on 3-day work weeks, and private homes no longer had heat in the winter. And so the conservatives are like, we can fix this. Vote for the Conservative Party. And in 1979, the Labour government was defeated in a confidence vote in Parliament, and she became prime minister, leading the Conservatives to victory in the general election with a majority of 43 seats, which was large. She's still running from Finchley. She's still running from the seat she first won in 1958. So for 21 years, she's been the member of Parliament from Finchley. Her key policies, she immediately went to the European community and said, we're paying you $500 million a year. That's too much. We want half of that back. And in 1979, if you remember your U.S. history, in December of that year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And she immediately went to the floor of the House of Parliament and condemned the Soviet invasion and said, we have to stand strong, we have to roll them back. I believe they were one of the few countries in the world that joined the U.S. in boycotting the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. So we boycotted, and I believe the UK boycotted as well. I'd have to look. I don't remember exactly that. She was facing severe economic difficulties in her first year. There was a deepening recession, there was rising unemployment, and now there was a steel strike. And some people were calling for her because she was trying to cut spending, balance the budget, at a time where unemployment was rising. And she was calling on the trade unions to be reeled in and for secondary picketing to be stopped, for the police to ensure that workers who didn't want to strike were allowed to continue working, which the unions opposed. And her own party was trying to get her to back down on some of these. She gave a speech at a party conference, very famous. She declared, you guys can change your minds if you want. This lady is not for turning. And she continued, and eventually her policies started turning things around. 1979, the end of white minority rule in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe independence in 1980. This was almost the first year of her tenure as prime minister. Her campaign for Britain's contribution to the European community was, I want my money back. We're not getting anything from the European community budget, and we're paying way too much, and we can't afford it. So you have to. It took her several years to get the concession. She finally did. In August of '79, the unrest in Northern Ireland just blew up. Lord Mountbatten, who was actually the uncle to the Queen, was assassinated, and they attacked a British army barracks in Northern Ireland and killed 18 soldiers. So she's facing a lot of challenges. The invasion of Afghanistan we talked about, steel strike, Housing Act. She introduced a right to buy. There were a huge number of government housing flats, government housing projects around England where people rented from the local government. And she introduced a right to buy for council tenants. It was a flagship policy. She believed in creating a property-owning democracy. And every year, her Treasury Department succeeded in converting a number of rental units into condominiums that were owned by the residents, on the order of 10 to 20,000 a year. Yep, there's that famous. In November of 1980, about a year after she had become prime minister, Ronald Reagan was elected U.S. president. They had actually gotten to know each other. She had made a prior visit when she was in the shadow cabinet in opposition to the U.S. and had met him. He was governor of California. And they had continued to correspond. After he ended his tenure as governor in California, he got a gig doing weekly radio addresses, and he would send her the scripts. And she would read them and write and send notes back about what she liked. So they actually were on the same page on almost every policy position, particularly in economic matters. 1981, serious urban riots in Brixton, Toxteth, and other cities, high unemployment, racial tension, policy issues. Finally, she reshuffles her cabinet. Unemployment exceeded 3 million in 1982. If you remember, this was, at the beginning of Reagan's presidency, the U.S. was facing similar economic challenges. Our inflation rate got up over 10, 12%. Our mortgage rate got to 14%. I bought a house with a mortgage at 14%. Yep. And then, in 1982, in April, suddenly, out of the blue, the Argentina junta, Argentina was ruled by a military dictatorship at that point. They were facing troubles at home. They thought to distract from their troubles at home by reclaiming the colonial outpost of Great Britain on the Falkland Islands. They sent a task force and took them over. And Thatcher immediately says, this will not stand. And so she assembled a fleet. She called up Ronald Reagan and said, you have to help us, get us all the intelligence you can. And it only took about 6 weeks. And the British recaptured South Georgia Island. They sunk the flagship of the Argentine Navy, the General Belgrano, and finally their landings at San Carlos, the capital. And you can see down there in the lower right-hand corner, Victory in the Falklands. That's a group of Argentinian soldiers who had been captured by the British soldiers. They surrendered in Port Stanley, and Thatcher is immediately wildly popular. I mean, it does just incredible things for the national mood in the United Kingdom. And so, of course, if you have a popular standing in the polls and you have the ability to call an election whenever you want, she calls a June 1983 general election. So about a year after the Great Victory, still riding high in the polls, and conservatives win a landslide majority of 144 seats. So now she is set for 5 more years. That was in June. In the fall, unfortunately, she and Ronald had a little bit of a tiff because there were a group of U.S. citizens. There's a medical school in the island of Grenada in the Caribbean, and The government of Grenada switched, came under the control of a socialist candidate who had close ties to Cuba, and there were threats that it was going to wind up joining the Eastern Socialist Bloc and becoming another Cuban outpost, another Soviet outpost in the Caribbean. So, and they were actually holding the American medical students semi-hostage. Reagan dispatched the Marines. The face cause was the rescue of the American citizens who were in Grenada and under threat, and secondarily the Monroe Doctrine, which says that no foreign power is allowed to intervene in our hemisphere. The problem was it was a part of the United Kingdom's Commonwealth of Nations, and he didn't let Margaret know before they sent troops. And it was a bit of an embarrassment for her in England. And she was genuinely a little irritated, to put it mildly, that she had not been consulted before the U.S. intervened militarily. They got over it. The relationship was restored, but there were a few rough months. In March of '84, the National Union of Mine Workers began a national strike. All of the mines. Now, the mines had all been nationalized. They were all owned by the British government. The private mining companies no longer existed. They were all under the direction of the National Coal Board. And they thought they could strike for, they wanted a 45% increase in wages. And they struck, and there were a small minority of miners. There were about 120 mines. There were about a dozen mines where the miners had voted against going out on strike and wanted to continue working. And the miners tried to block them with pickets. Thatcher coordinated with the local police, arranged for cooperative dispatch of police forces from neighboring areas so that the police were large enough in numbers to keep those mines open. She said a worker who wants to work should have the right to work. She was not unsympathetic to the work. I mean, she had grown up, working in a grocery store for her parents. But she said a worker who wants to work should be allowed to work, and refused to negotiate. Said 45% is out of the question. And as long as they're persisting with the national strike and with this these unlawful scare tactics, I'm not even going to negotiate with them. And a year later, they folded. And she announced that they were going to privatize the coal mine. They were going to sell them back to private companies. And the mine workers union had actually gone broke. They'd been paying strike funds throughout all of this. It later came out that they were being backed and given financial aid by Libya to unstabilize the UK government. That was a huge, it didn't come out for a few years, but yeah. In June of 1984, finally, she got her long-term rebate on their budget contribution. She really did get her money back. Took her a couple of years. In October of '84, just after she had won this smashing election, the IRA at the Conservative Party conference, this is like their annual national convention at a hotel in Brighton, they set off a bomb in the hotel in the room above her suite. Almost killed her. The intent was to kill her and her cabinet. 5 people were killed, including one of her cabinet members and his wife. She survived. She gave a speech the same day, and she declared terrorism will not defeat democracy, and she went after the IRA. In November, the first big privatization, British Telecom, that would be like the AT&T of the UK, which had been owned by, it had been nationalized under the Labour governments in the 50s. It was sold back to the public. It went public as a company with shares owned by private investors. In 1984, she was visited by a member of the Soviet Politburo. He was not yet in charge, but Mikhail Gorbachev. And Thatcher, after meeting with him, famously at a press conference said, "I believe I can do business with him." And she then sort of hoped that he would eventually become the leading figure. They also negotiated the end to British rule in Hong Kong. They had never actually owned the territory of Hong Kong. During the Opium War, they had signed a 120-year lease, I think, with the Chinese government under duress, British warships in the harbor and all that. And the lease was coming to an end. So rather than face a humiliating requirement that they back down, she negotiated the transfer with some guarantees for economic independence, continued economic independence for Hong Kong. Finally negotiated an agreement with the Irish to give the Republic of Ireland at least a consultative role in Northern Ireland affairs, but not forcing the government of Northern Ireland to do anything without their own consent. That was sort of the middle ground, hoping to put an end to the IRA violence. It did not completely succeed at doing that. She had a scandal in her second term. Her defense secretary had to resign. There was a British helicopter company, Westland, which was going broke. And there were allegations of bribery and private dealing and lack of transparency and lying at press conferences. It briefly threatened her position, but she survived. In 1986, there was a terrorist attack on U.S. servicemen in Berlin. They bombed a nightclub and killed a couple of U.S. servicemen and injured a number of others. The U.S. Launched airstrikes on Libya, could not get the NATO countries to cooperate. She allowed the U.S. to use their bases in the UK to launch that strike. They had to actually fly a circuitous route down the North Atlantic and through the Straits of Gibraltar because Spain and France refused to give permission for the flights to even pass over their territory. Thatcher said no. To retaliate against terrorist sponsoring states? Absolutely. 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear accident in Russia. Gorbachev had become secretary of the Politburo. This was the first major crisis that he faced, and it was a huge revelation as to how poorly run Soviet industry was. 1986, they deregulated the London Stock Exchange, and the city of London became a global financial center. She made a visit to the Soviet Union to meet Gorbachev, but while she was there, she insisted on meeting with dissident Andrei Sakharov. She said, "I'm not coming unless you let me meet with Sakharov." In June, called another election. Conservatives win a third consecutive general election with a majority of 100 seats. After that, she makes an official visit to the United States to meet with President Ronald Reagan. There's a financial crisis in '87. Some of us are old enough to remember that, stock market crash. Same year, she continued to privatize. British Airways, the British national airline, had been run by the government. She sold it back to shareholders. It went private. Rolls-Royce, not the luxury car company, that's a separate company. There's a Rolls-Royce company that made jet engines, still do. That had been taken over by the British government. She sold it back to the stockholders. The British Airports Authority that run Stanwick and Heathrow, she sold it off. It's still privately run. In 1988, she proposed to replace local property taxes with a flat per-person tax to pay for local government services. This is a so-called poll tax. This was a serious miscalculation on her part. But the British system was just absolutely antiquated and unfair. They were paying taxes based on I think in some cases, 1971 property values, and they had not been reevaluated. And so all kinds of changes had occurred, but people's property tax bills stayed the same. And if you didn't own any property, you didn't pay any property tax. And the property tax went to pay for local government. So she proposed, instead of a property tax, we're going to have a tax per person in a household. So a household of 3 will pay, £100 per person annual tax. Well, if you were a renter, you weren't paying any property tax. So this was immediately intensely unpopular. And she says, no, it will in the end, because you're paying the property tax because the people who own the building that you're paying rent to have the rents set to cover their property tax bill. They won't be paying a property tax bill anymore. They'll be paying the poll tax, the head tax. You'll be paying it as well. You'll get a reduction in rent and a new tax bill. people, A, didn't always understand that, and B, they just objected. They thought that was a terrible idea. She again asserted her opposition to the United States of Europe or surrendering any of the UK sovereignty. She's really the founder of the whole Brexit idea. She did not want to see a European common market that regulated member countries. She made foreign visits in '88 to Kenya, Nigeria, Australia, and Poland. She consulted with the Pope before her visit to Poland, expressed support for solidarity while she was there. She toured Gdansk with Lech Walesa, and then she visited Reagan in Washington as his last official foreign guest. And then in 1990, 2 years later, she was betrayed. The poll tax continued to be more and more unpopular. In the end, there was a massive demonstration, an anti-tax revolt in London with over 100,000 people in Trafalgar Square that actually degenerated into a riot. Cars were burned, windows were smashed. There were a lot of people mixed into the crowd who weren't just middle-class objectors, or people who were renters and who were objecting. There were a lot of people who were just the early anarchist movements who slipped in and used the opportunity, but it only increased the unpopularity of the idea, and her cabinet rebelled and said, we have to walk this back. And she said no, and so they challenged her, they held a vote. She won the vote, but not by enough to be declared. You have to win by like 55 or 60% in a party leadership vote. She didn't. And so she was persuaded that on a second round, she would not make any more votes. She'd lose votes. And so she resigned and was replaced by another party member, actually another member of her parliament, John Major, who had been her Chancellor of the Exchequer. And had been an ally and had not been a part of this challenge. But she's the one who thought would succeed her when she chose to retire, but she was forced to. So she went into retirement. After her retirement, she got all sorts of honors from the United Kingdom. She was actually given a seat in the House of Lords. She became a lady companion of the Order of the Garter. She got the Presidential Medal of Freedom from the United States, the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award from the Reagan Presidential Foundation. She stayed in touch with Reagan through the 90s. When Queen Elizabeth celebrated, I think it was her 85th birthday, Margaret Thatcher was the only former prime minister who was invited to the party. So lest anybody... Okay, there we go. Am I back on now? Yeah, I must have inadvertently hit the switch. Upon her resignation, President Bush said, she's a woman of principle. She stood for what she believed. She always knew where she was and what she believed. I think everyone in America would agree. Margaret Thatcher's been an outstanding ally. Margaret Thatcher was a completely reliable ally and partner. I could always count on her wise counsel, her firm support, and her loyal friendship, because she was senior to him in leadership. Even the French president said she will be seen as, with Winston Churchill, as the greatest prime minister of the last 50 years. The curtain has fallen on the Iron Lady. He used it. It was the Soviet nickname, but she liked it. He used it because he knew she liked it. Mikhail Gorbachev, when she retired, paid her a compliment. Lech Walesa, she was a great person. She contributed to the demise of communism in Poland and Central Europe. Angela Merkel hailed her. Barack Obama, when she died in 2013, this was the presidential statement. The world has lost one of the great champions of freedom and liberty, and America has lost a true friend. As a grocer's daughter who rose to become Britain's first female prime minister, she stands as an example to our daughters that there is no glass ceiling that can't be shattered. Here in America, many of us will never forget her standing shoulder to shoulder with President Reagan. If you had not told me the author of that, I would not have guessed Barack Obama. Yeah. So, I'm out of breath. But we got to the end. For 10 years, she was active, gave lots of speeches, wrote her memoirs. And then after 2000, her husband died in 2003. She was eventually diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She did come to Reagan's funeral in Washington. There's some very touching photographs with her paying her respects in the rotunda of the Capitol. Actually, she flew with the Reagan family on Air Force One to California for the ceremony out there where he was buried. There's some pictures of her on Air Force One then, but she was not in good health. And she sort of retired from public life after that. For the last 10 years, she was rarely seen in public, which of course sets us up for next month where we'll talk about Ronald Reagan. So any questions, comments?
Thatcher have some issues with the Queen while she was Prime Minister. I recall seeing something where there was conflict between the two, and I don't know if it was a female thing or what.
Yeah, I don't know that initially they liked each other. She could be a little stiff, and so could the Queen. I think because for 10 years she held that position. I think they gradually developed a working relationship. I think that the portrayal, there have been a couple of BBC series about Queen Elizabeth lately, and they cast an actress to play Margaret Thatcher and did not portray her very sympathetically. She's still seen as harsh, right-wing, insensitive, and sort of aristocratic and snobby, but she was not aristocratic. In fact, she had trouble with the aristocratic circle in her own party. They viewed her as the grocer's daughter. She really had a great deal of empathy for the British middle class, and for those actually, because of her work at the Pensions and Social Security Department, she understood what people who really needed government support needed. And she never denounced those receiving government support as somehow unworthy or lazy or whatever. She said, no, we owe them our support and we should continue it. But she objected to the government becoming so enmeshed in the British economic system, and she objected to the power of the unions to extort money, especially when they were extorting money in businesses that were owned by the government. So, and she broke the union's power. She broke the mine workers. There was a famous strike at one of Rupert Murdoch's printing plants where they all went on strike, tried to shut him down. And he had already arranged for substitute workers to continue to print his newspapers. And there was the Battle of Wapping. He had built a new printing plant, and she gave full cooperation. If there are people who want to work, they should have the right to work. She would not let the pickets shut the newspaper down. So it's a remarkable lady.
You were going to mention why her papers ended up at Cambridge.
Oh, yes. Well, she's an Oxford grad. And about halfway through her tenure as prime minister, Oxford had always, since, the 1800s, any Oxford graduate who took the office of prime minister was very soon after their election given an honorary doctorate from the university. And so several people at Oxford put forward the motion that they should give Margaret Thatcher an honorary doctorate because she was, in fact, an Oxford graduate in good standing. She had a degree in chemistry. And the faculty voted it down. And she was terribly hurt that her alma mater, because she had always had fond feelings. She felt like she'd gotten a good education. She had enjoyed her time there. The Oxford Conservative Union, she knew that not everybody on campus had agreed with her, but she felt warmly about the college. And so when she came to make arrangements for her papers, Winston Churchill's papers were all at Cambridge, and that gave her the obvious. So her papers are with Churchill's papers at Cambridge, because she's like, fine. You rejected giving me an honor, so I'm not giving you my papers. Well, thanks for coming out, and I hope you'll come back next month. I get to do Ronald Reagan.
Absolutely.
record of it. She had to have known who they were, but she quoted Lewis in several of her speeches. Not Tolkien that I know of. Her father was Methodist, and she was sort of Methodist in her inclinations for her whole life. So I don't think she would have warmed up to a Roman Catholic professor. But she thought very, very highly of Lewis. And we know from her quotes of him in her political speeches, even as prime minister, she quoted him several times. But I don't know that they ever met.
Well, I'd like to believe that they did.
Yeah, it would be fun.
Thanks, Rob.
Yep. Thank you guys for coming.